Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my Bear Druid class guide for Shadowlands. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. I will be doing my best to respond to everyone who has questions about class changes, since we are still getting massive changes even as we're in the middle of the final weekend before launch. Also, barring any kind of emergency like my computer catching on fire, my house catching on fire, or me catching on fire, I believe I just put out 6 tank guides in 3 days. If that doesn't deserve a like and subscribe, I don't know what does. Alright, let's go. First question, same as always, why play Bear Druid? I think there are several good answers to this question, but basically, the class is stable, it's pretty tanky, and it has a ton of utility. Back when I did the previous, the preview video on bears, I wasn't really loving the state of the class. It felt like they had received several baseline nerfs, and while they did have some cool new stuff waiting for them in Shadowlands, I was just a little disappointed. Fortunately, as we've gotten to see more and more of the in-game content and reward systems take shape in the Shadowlands beta, the class has really started to look a lot more appealing. Between Covenants, Conduits, and Legendaries, I think Bear Druids are going to be in a spot where they have a lot of powerful, interesting bonuses that they can use to change the way that they play, which will allow for a lot of build customization that simply wasn't there for them in BFA, and really is, I mean, people make jokes about class fantasy, but being customizable and versatile is the core class fantasy of playing a druid. So anyway, on to the fun stuff, starting with Covenants. Obviously, this still could change. I really hope it doesn't, but you never know. Let's go through the Covenants in order of usefulness, sort of. To be honest, Druid has 4 useful competitive Covenants now, and it's actually pretty hard to say any of them suck or that any of them are clearly the best. Well, anyways, let's start with the Necrolords. They are the #1 option for dealing single target and 2 target cleave damage. So, you know, raid. They provide a decent, steady trickle of self-healing, and they feel really, really nice in the rotation. Adaptive Swarm is just like a perfect ability to throw into the rotation that really gives you a nice mixture of damage and healing. It's really, really good. The way it works seems straightforward. It's a 25-second cooldown, 12-second dot and hot that has 3 stacks, and when it expires, it consumes a stack and jumps to another target, alternating between friends and foes. So naturally, you would assume it has about a 50% uptime as a dot and a 50% uptime as a hot, but because of the way it works when it merges on a jump, it can actually have significantly higher uptime as a dot, and that's why it's the best damage dealing option. So because of the way it jumps back and forth, its cooldown and its travel time, you can frequently find yourself in the situation where it's coming off of cooldown and jumping back to you around the same time. So if you hold off for a second or two to desync the buff durations, basically give yourself a 10-second hot and then apply a 12-second dot to the enemy, when it leaps off of you, it will refresh their dot and add to their buff stacks, essentially giving you 20 to 23 seconds of straight dot in a row. In multi-target fights, this is a lot more straightforward. You just apply it to multiple enemies, and it'll do a good job of trying to leap around to as many targets as possible rather than stacking up, because the stacks don't do anything other than give it more jumps. So if you have 1 stack on an enemy, it's going to do 1200 damage or whatever. If you have 5 stacks, it's going to do 1200 damage on them. Ultimately, this is a really good skill that deals a ton of damage, and while Thrash's dot isn't really a big deal, Moonfire's dot damage is seriously underrated. Getting an extra 20% or more with the Conduit is really, really good, and if you choose to do any sort of cat weaving at all, the damage really starts to jump up. The Necrolord's signature skill is still pretty underwhelming. It basically just lets you channel a shield up before boss pulls or in between trash packs and Mythic Plus. Starting off combat with a decent sized shield is good, but it will get chewed up pretty quickly, so it's not like it's a major critical defensive gain. It's not as useful as the reactive self-healing potion that you get from being a Kyrian, and you definitely shouldn't try to channel it while you're actively tanking. Because channeling the shield prevents you from dodging, you'll wind up taking more damage than you would have prevented. So it's not that great of a bonus for tanks, but given that bears have probably the toughest time of any of the tanks at the start of fights before they can get rage up to get iron for rolling, they are the one class that I think is a little bit of an exception to, I think it's not good, but it is a little useful for bears. And finally, Necrolord Soulbinds for Bear Druids are pretty decent. Amini is the highest performer in early sims since she grants you a 13% agility buff when you cast Adaptive Swarm. Unfortunately, that buff has a weird time duration scaling component to it that's based off of the ability cooldown. So it's only down to 4 seconds for druids. I think that's probably not competitive, even though the sims initially said it was. Bonesmith Hirmir is arguably a stronger option, certainly better for AoE, just due to the reflective damage of serrated Spalders. It adds up to a decent amount of damage, but it does force you away from a second potency conduit, and I really don't like that very much. Kyrian is the #1 defensive choice for Bear Druid in both Mythic Plus and in raids. Kindred Spirits grants a very significant defensive cooldown for another member of your group. I had some very negative things to say about this during my earlier Druid preview, and I stand behind them for the most part, but I think the reality is pretty simple. Yeah, this kind of sucks as a tool to throw onto another tank in a normal 2-tank fight, since you basically just funnel damage out of each other and back into each other at the same time, and that is stupid. But as a cooldown for progression rating on a taunt swap fight, it's very good. For tossing onto a healer to keep them alive with a cooldown, or to keep yourself alive with a huge burst of self-healing that you're pulling out of them, it's very good. For tossing onto a DPS to keep them safe while they get fixated in a Mythic Plus or in a boss fight, it's very good. I don't like the way the ability works at its core. You have to spend a couple of seconds casting the ability onto an ally, which grants you both a buff that lasts for an hour. Once you've done that, you can instantly reactivate it on a 1-minute cooldown. It's totally fine if you know who you're going to need to shield ahead of time, but as a quick reactive tool like an intervene or throwing a blessing of protection onto somebody or sacrifice, it's not great. And in my prior review, I underestimated how often you'll know who you want to shield ahead of time. Usually it's going to be a healer or someone who doesn't have a great defensive cooldown like Ice Block or Feign Death or Vanish. I think the real downside of this ability, and it's the reason I probably would never consider using it, is that it's pretty much all defense. You can link to a DPS player and get a pretty decent damage boost, but it's a lot, it's more complicated and less powerful than the DPS gain of just going with a different, more standard Covenant. It's a defensive option, which means it's not going to be useful for the vast majority of players. If you need the defenses to progress, if it's not possible to do it without them, then how are any of the other Covenants going to be competitive? And if you don't require the defenses, then what's the point of adding more? Are you gonna mitigate a boss to death? Ultimately, it is a good utility choice if you really, really want to be a big utility boy. Otherwise, I would say skip it for something more fun. Kyrian still has the best signature skill for tanks, an extra health potion. Having access to another instant self-healing tool is a really good thing, and while some of the more important bleeds in Castle Nathria have been flagged as no longer being removed by this potion, not all of them have, and it's still a really good defensive tool to add into the rest of your kit. Beyond that, Kyrian has a decent soulbind in Pelagos. Even after the nerf to his versatility passive, he's arguably the best option. He grants an extra 10% mastery for 10 to 20 seconds, depending on how many balls you pick up after using Kindred Spirits, which is very good. The only downside is the Kyrian Conduit reduces its cooldown below 1 minute, which is 1 minute is the internal cooldown on combat meditation. So it actually becomes a throughput loss to use that conduit. He also grants a baseline 3% magic damage reduction that's just up all the time, and that's fine. More importantly, he lets you run the ideal conduit route of 2 potency, 2 endurance, which is the preferred setup for bears. Clea is a decent soulbind alternative if you really want to be a complete utility boy, but her reactive healing bonus was nerfed into the ground, and her crit buff was also nerfed. She could be competitive once you've totally unlocked her tree, but that's going to take multiple months, and I don't think she's worth using over Pelagos prior to that point, if she even is at all. Next up is Venthyr, and I think they actually might be my favorite option for Druids. I've been leaning heavily toward playing it, but given that Druid is the only class I think I would enjoy as Necrolord, I don't know. It's a really tough choice. Venthyr Druid is really pretty simple. Ravenous Frenzy is a powerful 3-minute cooldown that lines up perfectly with Berserker Incarnation. You pop them together when tanking a huge AoE pack in Mythic Plus, or during ad spawns on a hectic ad cleave fight. You spam Thrash like you're trying to break your Thrash keybind, and you deal huge amounts of damage, and that's about it. It's really, really good in that situation, and those burst windows are incredibly fun. But unfortunately, it doesn't really provide anything in between those spots. It's clearly the #1 AoE damage spec in preliminary sims for bears, but the cases where you can actually fight 3 to 5 bosses at the same time, all stacked in melee range with each other for 5 minutes at a time, are insanely rare. The case of pulling together 3 packs at once in a Mythic Plus is a lot more common, and I really think that would be the main use case for this Covenant. The signature skill for Venthyr is Door of Shadows, which is basically just a teleport with a cast time. You can use it to skip past trash packs or blink through boss mechanics, and that's cool. An instant mobility skill is a tool that's basically always good, and Druids don't really have anything else like it, so can't complain. The best soulbind for Venthyr, I think, is arguably Theotar the Mad Duke. He offers a really big mastery buff at the top of his tree, and the ideal 2 potency, 2 endurance conduit setup. You also get Token of Appreciation down at the bottom of the tree, which throws a little shield to anyone who heals you. It's not like a huge deal, but it's very polite. And if you're looking for a more defensive setup, you could always just go with General Draven. He is a purely defensive tree, but it's a really good defensive setup if you need it. Last up are the Night Fae, and their ability is Convoke the Spirits, which just got a 33% buff within the last 24 hours. It has been changed to prioritize casting more single target damage skills, and you can move while channeling. The sims for it post buff aren't finished, and frankly, I can't wait any longer to make this video. Right now, the projection is that this will be right around Necrolord in terms of single target DPS, and I would be really surprised if it's way out in front, or way behind either. Now, because of the spells it chooses to cast while you're in bear form, it tends to still not be competitive with Venthyr and AoE, and it is, again, right about on par with Necrolord in AoE. Really, it's a choice between constant sustained 1 and 2 target DPS from Necrolord, or a big burst of 1 to 2 target DPS from Night Fae. The only serious problem I have with Druid's Night Fae ability is that it's a channel, and while you can move, and it can apply defensive and healing spells like Iron Fur, Regrowth, and Rejuve, it's just a little weird to channel something for 4 seconds while tanking, and it is a little unreliable. Sometimes it won't cast Iron Fur, maybe once. Sometimes it'll cast it like 4 times. It's inconsistent. Also, while I normally gravitate towards more burst damage over sustained, because it's a channel, you can't really layer any of your other cooldowns over it like you could with a more normal offensive cooldown, such as the Venthyr ability or Berserk or Heart of the Wild or so on. You can still layer it with agility potions or trinkets, I suppose. Here's the bottom line. This is a good option. They are literally all good options. I thought Monk was a hard choice, and It is, but Druid is arguably harder now thanks to the changes they've made over just the last 2 days. The Night Fae signature skill Soul Shape is a simple mobility skill. More mobility is a good thing, but not really necessary and not generally as useful as Door of Shadows. Additionally, and one really big negative for Bear Druid that no other class really has to deal with Soul Shape is that it shifts you out of bear form. So then you have to waste a global shifting back into bear form. So I'm not saying that's enough to disqualify Night Fae, but it does mean that your signature skill is going to be directly at odds with your ability to stay tanky. Not great. The best soulbind associated with the Night Fae is Naya, who grants you a stacking, non-refreshing mastery and max health buff when you cast Convoke the Spirits. She wasn't quite on par with Dreamweaver initially, but they nerfed Dreamweaver and buffed Convoke the Spirits, and I think that will probably push Naya ahead. She will force you through a finesse conduit, which isn't ideal, but she's still decent. Burrs in the bottom tier behind the final endurance conduit was just changed to work on bosses, so it may be worth foregoing the second potency conduit to get for more sustained DPS. I don't think so, but maybe in single target. Maybe. Alright, so the quick summary on Covenants is that literally all of them are pretty good and pretty appealing. Necrolord and Night Fae are both good single target damage options, both very good for raiding. They are also pretty good in Mythic Plus if you're not consistently doing huge multi-pack pulls. If you are doing huge multi-pack pulls in Mythic Plus, then Venthyr is going to be way more useful for you than the competition, and you probably should take it to maximize your DPS in those situations. Kyrian is arguably the weakest link, but if you really want a defensive option that lets you be more of a utility character to fit that Druid archetype, then they're the number one, no question. Alright, I talked about soulbinds and pointed out the best trees, but now let's quickly cover conduits which fit into those empty sockets in the soulbind trees. There are 3 kinds of conduits. Potency, increase your damage and sometimes healing. Endurance, increase your defenses and sometimes healing, and Finesse are generally utility choices, but in the case of Druid, can increase your damage and healing. So let's just break them down quickly. Unchecked Aggression is the better of the 2 generic conduits available to all Bear Druids. It's extremely strong and adds a ton of haste during Berserk and Incarnation. It's your best potency conduit. Savage Combatant is the other generic conduit available to Bear Druids, and it's a little on the weaker side. Adding damage to Maul as a stacking buff sort of creates a fun gameplay loop where you occasionally cast Maul for a big burst of damage. Unfortunately, it doesn't really do anything about Maul being on the GCD or having an annoying rage cost, and as a result, it's not a great conduit, and it's not really competitive with any of the Covenant conduits at all. Evolved Swarm is the Necrolord potency conduit, and it's pretty nice. It just ratchets up the damage over time multiplier for Moonfire and Thrash even further, and that's simple but really good. It also ratchets up the damage over time multiplier for any of your kitty cat dots if you're cat weaving. Anyways, Deep Allegiance is the Kyrian potency conduit. I mentioned it before, but while this is a good conduit for increasing your value as a utility player for your group, it does cause Kindred Spirits to have a shorter cooldown than the internal cooldown on Pelagos' Mastery buff, which isn't terrific. Or I don't know, maybe it's not a problem at all. Maybe they'll totally change that or remove it by the time this is relevant. In any case, it's not the end of the world, but if that does hold true, I probably wouldn't use this bonus at lower levels, unless you decide to go with Klea's tree instead. Endless Thirst is the Venthyr potency conduit. It's a little undertuned at lower ranks, but at higher ranks with a decent amount of gear and popping Incarnation and Ravenous Frenzy together, while also running Unchecked Aggression, this is a pretty substantial DPS increase. More damage, more haste, more crit, even more haste, and just being able to spam Thrash while you're in AoE is a recipe for a lot of damage. And finally, Conflux of Elements is the Night Fae potency conduit. It's just a simple damage increase while channeling Convoke the Spirits. It's a good bonus that makes your big damage cooldown even burstier, and lines up with Naya's big mastery buff to really push your damage to its limits. Endurance conduits are thankfully pretty simple. Tough as Bark is the best endurance conduit available to Bear Druids. It reduces Barkskin's cooldown by a decent amount, and stacks with Survival of the Fittest in the talent tree to push that cooldown even lower. You can really get Barkskin uptime to be pretty decent at higher ranks, and with the right legendary, this can be an extremely tanky setup. Layered Mane gives you the familiar bonus of occasionally getting 2 stacks of Iron Fur per cast instead of 1. It's not a huge bonus, but it is a good defensive boost from time to time, and you should take it in any 2 endurance conduit setup. Finally, if you ever use a 3 endurance conduit setup, Innate Resolve will up your self-healing by quite a bit. Druid self-healing is mostly limited by the long cooldown on Frenzied Regeneration, or the difficulty of getting out of melee range to shift into caster form and just directly cast heals onto yourself, and this doesn't help with either of those 2 issues, but it does make your self-heals hit a lot harder. The other 2 conduits are not terrible, but they are a lot more situational. And finally, Finesse Conduits. Born of the Wilds is one of those rare Finesse Conduits that's actually a direct throughput increase due to the weird nature of Heart of the Wild. You may notice that the Balance Heart of the Wild increases the damage of your balance abilities. Moonfire is a balance ability, even though you can use it in bear form. That's it. Front of the pack is not really worth mentioning, but again, if you really want to be a super group utility machine, then tacking a little bit more power onto your big AoE movement speed buff is a good idea. The other Finesse conduits, not worth mentioning. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and there is a lot to talk about here. First is Lufa Infused Embrace. These are the best AoE DPS option. They don't have much value defensively, although they do let Thrash stack up to 4 stacks, so that's about another 2% more damage reduction from Rend and Tear. But that is about it. It's just a good, consistent, powerful AoE DPS legendary. Ursoc's Fury Remembered is another very competitive AoE DPS option. It's weaker in terms of total damage output, but as you can see, it has way more defensive power thanks to the Absorb Shield it provides from Thrash damage. I think these are both competitive appealing options, and you will eventually want to use both of them, especially once Blizzard has the brand new idea that they didn't just steal from Legion of letting players wear 2 legendaries at once, probably 9.1. Until that point, I think Ursoc's Fury Remembered will be the more important of the 2 despite being weaker offensively, just because it has so much more defensive value. Next up are 2 single target oriented options. Legacy of the Sleeper is a substantial single target DPS increase that adds a ton of power onto Berserk and Incarnation. It is useful in AoE as well, although it's not as powerful as the 2 previous options. Draft of Deep Focus is the #1 single target DPS option that synergizes extremely well when cat weaving, but it only works in single target. It is really nice when used along with Necrolord. And Circle of Life and Death is an interesting alternative on 2 target fights where you can cat weave, but I think that's an uncommon enough situation to not justify making a 5th or 6th legendary for it. And finally, the best defensive legendary for Bear Druids is the Natural Order's Will. It's extremely powerful. It buffs Barkskin's damage reduction up by another 10%. It makes it cast Frenzied Regen and Iron Fur both when you cast it and when it falls off. And it doesn't have any kind of internal cooldown. So with conduits and talents, you can bring Barkskin's cooldown into the 30-something range, and it just stays incredibly strong. It's a terrific defensive bonus that will be really good for Bear Druids trying to push high-level Mythic Plus or cutting-edge Mythic Raid progression. Alright, now that we've covered all the new Shadowlands class features, let's just focus on the basics, and here's talents. This is the setup I would run for Mythic Plus. Bear Druid has a lot lot of talent swaps, so let me go over them relatively quickly. In the first tier, Brambles, Blood Frenzy, and Bristling Fur are all useful in different situations. Brambles is the best for DPS, Blood Frenzy is the best rage generator in AoE, so generally speaking the best defensive choice for Mythic Plus, and Bristling Fur is the best rage generator in single target. Because Bristling Fur is still on the GCD, I really don't like it. But you can cast it as you pull or before taunt swaps to help offset that irritating GCD cost. Still though, I think you could never use it and be okay. All three of the off-spec affinities have some merit. Balance is arguably my favorite in terms of the passive value. Having more melee range is really nice, but they're all very good. If you're not cat weaving or owl weaving, or shifting out and healing to make full use of Heart of the Wild, the only real extra bit of value you can get out of either tier is by using Balance Affinity and Heart of the Wild to get 30% more Moonfire damage, which will work even while you're in bear form. And maybe it's not great, but it's more damage than Mighty Bash is gonna do.
And here are the raid talents.
Alright, Galactic Guardian is the DPS choice in its tier, and it does help with rage generation as well. Incarnation is a burst DPS cooldown and kind of a defensive cooldown as well, but it's generally way weaker as a sustained DPS talent now that Berserk is back to being a baseline skill, so you really only want it as a specific burst DPS cooldown for huge, quick, massive DPS pulls in Mythic Plus, or maybe more realistically as a defensive cooldown for max tankiness builds in Raid. Survival of the Fittest has been a weaker talent than Earth Warden throughout BFA, more or less, but with Conduits reducing its cooldown by a considerable margin, I think it's very, very appealing now to run this even if you're not running the full Barkskin Legendary setup. That doesn't mean it's mandatory. Earth Warden is still a very good source of reliable extra damage reduction, and it's still a terrific pick, but I like the Barkskin Conduit and Survival of the Fittest together, even without the Natural Order's Will. And finally, Rend and Tear is still simple and excellent. It's my favorite option, but Pulverize has been substantially redesigned and it's really good now. It's 10 seconds of 35% damage reduction on a 45-second cooldown. It's extremely strong as a defensive skill in raids. It's sort of like a miniature shield wall. The only downsides are that it's single target only. Tooth and Claw is also fun, and it's sort of an in-between pick, but I think that hurts its value a little bit because you either want to go full defensive mode with Pulverize or full easy mode with Rend and Tear. But Tooth and Claw is legitimately not a bad choice. There's not a ton to say about the Bear Druid rotation. I think I said that about every single one of the rotations, but hey, it's certainly true here. You want to use your major cooldowns as much as you can, but that just means your Covenant ability, Heart of the Wild if you're Balance Affinity, and Berserker Incarnation. There is a ton you could say about cat weaving, but I think that's a topic for another video. Nothing really changes with the Covenants. You will want to use them pretty much on cooldown regardless of your build or your Covenant. As for Iron Fur, just maintain stacks whenever you're actively tanking. If you see a big burst of physical damages coming in, do make an effort to get 2 or 3 stacks of Iron Fur up to mitigate it. Be aggressive with Barkskin and Survival Instincts, and use Frenzied Regen to get your health pool back up after you get chunked down. The basic stat priority for Bear Druid is pretty much the same as it always has been, and pretty much the same as it is for all of the tanks except for Monk. Haste is the most important stat. You want as much as you can get. Versatility is also very good. It adds damage, healing, and constant damage reduction. It's just good and safe. Crit's good offensively, but less consistent defensively. And Mastery is consistent defensively, but, you know, a little boring and mediocre offensively. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are sockets and item level, then haste, then versatility, and then the rest of the stats don't matter all that much. In terms of notable pieces of gear, most of it's pretty interchangeable. The only things you really want to focus on in terms of their itemization for the first few weeks would be rings, amulets, and trinkets. Lightless force on your weapon is the way to go for dealing damage. As far as damaging trinkets go, there are some decent ones from Dungeons and Raid. Pretty much all of the on-use ones are at least decent. The two best trinkets from Dungeons are Phial of Putrefaction and Shadowgrasp Totem. The two best trinkets from Raid are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire Denathrius and Stone Legion Heraldry from the Stone Legion Generals. The Dark Moon decks this expansion aren't great. The DPS one lets you leech haste from your enemy for a 20-second haste buff on a 90-second cooldown. It's not bad, but it's really not great. The tank one is also a 90-second cooldown, and it grants you a minor brief defensive cooldown that basically blocks part of the next 5 hits. I feel like this bonus is pretty underwhelming. Neither of them are bad if you have gold burning a hole in your pocket and you want a quick trinket to boost your item level and, get you going, but they aren't mandatory or really even anything all that special. If you have to choose, I think I would go after the DPS trinket, and since they're unique equipped, you do have to choose. We're all feeling pretty excited for Shadowlands. Druid is poised to have a pretty good start to the expansion, and I'm actually still not sure what I'm gonna play it as. I was all ready to be a Necrolord Bear Druid, but now I'm not sure. Maybe I'll be Night Fae. Maybe Venthyr. Who knows? The last thing I'll say is this. Druid has 4 really good Covenants, and I think they're one of the few tanks that haven't been let down by the Covenant system. There truly is something for everyone. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Bear Druids and Shadowlands, please ask. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.